friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. Today I am going to be reviewing both the Redeeming Love book and movie. I'm honestly very surprised. I mentioned this in my January wrap-up that I reread this book and watched the movie, and I didn't want to go into too many details of my thoughts in that January wrap-up, and I asked if you guys wanted a separate video, and here we go. It was very requested. I'm thankful that you guys care at all about what I think. I do want to give a disclaimer though that as much as I have loved being on BookTube, I still don't consider myself a book reviewer and don't really feel completely comfortable in that space. I even rarely write like Goodreads reviews because I feel unqualified for some reason, but I will try my best. I'm honestly very impressed by a lot of booktubers on here who do review books and keep their thoughts like concise and have so many eloquent things to say. Again, I'll try my best, but no promises. And I'm also not a movie critic, but I just wanted to throw out my thoughts and opinion because I considered Redeeming Love one of my all-time favorite books of all time. I read this for the first time 10 or so years ago, and I reread this recently, and I have some thoughts on it, and I also have some thoughts on the movie that just came out. So that's what this video is going to be. Now, I'm going to start with a quick synopsis. If you're, for some reason, unfamiliar with this book and movie, I'll just give a quick rundown. This is a Christian fiction book inspired by the biblical story of Hosea. This whole book is a biblical allegory of God's love, and ultimately this is a love story, a romance between a husband and a wife, where the husband is this very strong man of faith, and then he one day sees a woman on the streets in a small town in California during the 1850s gold rush. Turns out that she is a prostitute, but he hears God's voice saying that's going to be your wife, and so he takes her home to his farm and tries to show her a different way of living. She has a lot of hesitation and completely does not trust men and is not really cool with the whole situation, but she slowly starts to break down her walls and get transformed by a man named Michael Hosea, but then ultimately God, and like feeling God's love. So that's the quick summary, and I would say the movie is the same. I feel like every single 16-year-old Christian girl who grew up in the church and like was surrounded by Christian people was like fed this book. Like, this is the book. This is like the best book you could read. I picked this up around the same time that I was reading Twilight and stuff, you know? So I was like, no, read this romance instead. This is better. And honestly, I don't regret reading it. I read it for the first time, like I said, 10 years ago. I was 16-year-old Gloria, fell in love with this book. I reread it just now in January, and I have some thoughts. I will honestly say that it was still a completely compulsive read. Like, I read it in just a couple days. It did make me cry in the end. There were some very strong points in it, some beautiful imagery of God's love. There were also some content issues that I just felt very uncomfortable reading. And I guess I will say, I don't know, spoilers, because I'm gonna go into some details of this book. So one of my main irks is that one of the main characters, Michael Hosea, who's supposed to be this like perfect man, he doesn't have any problems, or even the ones he does, he's just right there with God talking about all his problems and like working through them. And he's showing Angel, the main female character of this book, a new way of life and a different kind of man that actually loves her unconditionally. I think it goes without saying that he's too perfect of a character, like he's this amazing man, but then at the same time he's not, because he's really aggressive, and it almost felt like it was not consensual, not the sexual content, which we'll get to in a minute, but like even her wanting to marry him. There was no actual consent in really that situation, and I just felt very uncomfortable with the whole thing. And she has a whole pattern of leaving, so she leaves him many times throughout this book, and he either ends up going into town and dragging her back, or at the end she comes back from her own free will. But that felt uncomfortable to read. Like, she did not want to be there for a reason. She chose what she was doing, and yeah, there's a bigger story and theme throughout it all, but I wasn't really cool with that. I was talking about this with a friend of mine, and she was just like, well, think about the historical setting, 1850s man and women kind of relations and what was expected. And I feel like maybe that helps a little bit to wrap my mind around like what an actual man would have been behaving like in that time period, and what this character did was actually very kind, but reading it still made me uncomfortable. And then one other kind of main realization in this reread is that this is a very sexually heavy book. Although it is not explicit, really, there's no like explicit, you know, description of body stuff and what's going on, but it is just full of sexual tension and also extreme sexual trauma. This main character gets raped at the age of 8 years old and then continually experiences sexual trauma and just horrible sexual experiences with men. And this entire book is her working through that. I feel like I wouldn't just easily hand this to a young girl in hindsight. There's some good stuff in here, but this is also very, very heavy. There were no trigger warnings back when I was told that I should read this book. One other critique about this book, and really the movie, is that the characters are too stubborn. I know that there are stubborn people out there, but I don't think anyone is too stubborn. They were almost unrealistically stubborn. Every single character was so set in their ways and so determined about what they thought was right that it just completely affected the plot of like making progress because they were so stubborn. And I was like, you all just need to get over it. People are not actually this stubborn in real life. I think people are much more open-minded and like hear people out and can have a normal conversation. So some moments and dialogue and some things irked me because I was like, just, can you get over it? Can you move on? So yeah, that was one other thing that I was like, not my favorite. One of the main things that I really enjoyed about it, again, this is a Christian book, there is dialogue between the characters and God all throughout the book. Like they are constantly just talking to God. And I actually really enjoyed that because I feel like that was one of the more realistic parts of the book, is just like these characters truly relying, we're really one main character, truly relying on God through everything that he's doing throughout his day. And ultimately that's what we should be doing as Christians if we are following Jesus, and like conversing with God, trying to hear his voice, putting your life in his hands, his will above your own, and just going through your day to day with that mindset. I really appreciated reading about that. And I would say that it was actually probably the most encouraging part of rereading this book, was seeing that in these characters. So I actually enjoyed that part. I still don't know if I would consider this a favorite book of all time. I wouldn't rate it super poorly. I'm still gonna keep it. I feel like I still might reread it in my future, but will I be like giving this to my teenage daughter someday and being like, you need to read this? I don't know if I would. I would at least give more context and warning about what this book is about and what it holds than just, you know, this is the best romance book ever. This is like the most beautiful picture of a love story. I feel like I would hold back from saying those kinds of things. Now let's get into the movie. This is a very popular book, and obviously the movie then is receiving some hype around all of the fans of this book. So I think this book is around like 3 million copies sold. It's been translated into a bunch of different languages. Like a lot of people are very familiar with this story who call themselves Christian, and I was the same way. I'm like, this was one of my favorite books of all time. Of course I'm gonna watch the movie. So there is some, you know, videos out there about like basically saying if you're Christian, you shouldn't watch this movie. I watched those videos and understand some points they were trying to make. However, I don't fully agree with telling people what they should or shouldn't be reading or watching. I think that is not my job to say. And I also feel like if you're gonna tell people to not watch this movie because of the sexual content, that opens the door to a lot of other things. If we're gonna go that route, then it's really like, no Christians should be drinking alcohol. No Christians should be reading any kind of romance or watching any kind of romance. Christians should not do this, Christians should not do that. And that's like a whole different conversation that I don't really want to get into. And I'll just say some thoughts. This movie is very sexual. Like, so sexual that I was watching with a friend and I was just kind of like, wow, I need to look away. Like, this is pretty intense. Like, the book has some sexual scenes, but they're very like brief and also vague, and nothing's totally described in detail. The movie definitely crosses a certain line, I would say, and it goes farther than that. Like, I would compare it to a lot of sexual scenes that are in like regular secular rom-coms. I would say the movie did not shy away from that, and it also really did not shy away from her profession as a prostitute, because in a lot of scenes she's almost completely naked, but just having enough hair to cover the nipples, or like just a shawl to cover the boob, but basically otherwise like naked. And you're just kind of like, wow, okay, you could have been like wearing something else and the scene could have still been portrayed, but they just kind of like went there in the movie to make the point. And so I guess I would say, if you're going into the movie thinking this is going to be a very Christian, clean movie with no sexual content, that's not the kind of movie. There's some stuff in there that like I was like, wow, all right, I feel like I'm watching a little bit too much. But again, that's my personal preference. My friend absolutely loved the movie and was like bawling the whole time because she thought it was so powerful. I feel like it's very subjective, but know going into the movie that there is some sexual scenes. I'll get back to some of the sex stuff in a minute, but I also just want to say a general, like, I enjoyed the movie overall. The book, of course, to me was a million times better. There are so many more details in the book and dialogue and character growth that happens in the book that is completely not portrayed enough in the movie. You don't get enough time with the characters to see that growth. And there's also just like a lot of other side characters that were not fully included or fully fleshed out because they just didn't have the time to do it. The movie was just like main highlights, and there were scenes that just said like 3 months later, 3 years later, etc. versus the book actually goes through those months and those years. The movie just like jumps around. And so in that sense, I felt a little bit cheated because I did read the book and then literally the next day went to go watch the movie and was like, oh my gosh, they're missing that. They're missing that. They're not even including that character. Are you kidding me? So I had a little bit of that going on in my mind. Maybe if I spaced out a bit, I would have felt a little bit less like peeved that they missed so much. Another thing, small thing, just totally irked me. I mean, this whole book describes Angel, the main character, the prostitute, as like the most beautiful woman like that anyone has ever seen. Every single person turns their head to look at her. And in the movie, her hair was like perfectly curled every single scene, even when she's supposed to be like working on a farm and doesn't have any clothing. I'm like, wow, your hair is like perfectly curled. I mean, it's a movie set, but I was like, unrealistic. Like perfect makeup, just like looks amazing. And I'm like, you're supposed to kind of look like you're like disheveled working on the farm as a farmer's wife, but you're still like this gorgeous model. And let me try to end with like a main thought and kind of like takeaway, and it's surrounding the sexual content of the movie and the book, but more so the movie because I feel like it was more in the movie than it was in the book. One main problem I had that I really actually felt extremely uncomfortable watching, this woman who experiences, like I said, extreme sexual trauma, just rape and then like terrible things, watching terrible things happen to others and also herself. And then in the movie, like only a certain amount of time goes by between her getting married to this farmer and their first time consummating their marriage and having sex for the first time. In a book, there's a longer span of time between those two events, between the marriage and the consummation. And in the book, the male character, the husband, is a virgin until his first time with Angel, and a longer time passes, like I said. In the movie, it really only feels like a couple months. And also in the book, their first time, you know, she's still like going through everything and like in that uncomfortableness of the situation. She's not like, yes, I want sex and I'm ready for it and like, come to me, my husband. Like that is not what the book portrayed for their first time. In the movie, completely opposite. It felt like, again, like a couple months went by and then just out of nowhere, she's like really into it. He's really into it. She's like fully experiencing an orgasm and they're like against the wall. And I'm like, no, like this is not okay, because I feel like you are completely invalidating your sexual trauma. Now, I'm not saying by any means that people who have experienced sexual abuse cannot have like fulfilling sexual lives, but I'm like, this is not a fair portrayal. I feel like they did not ask someone who would have experienced that kind of sexual trauma and background what having sex for the first time would be like in like a freeing sense. It just felt very unrealistic and like this fantasy, and basically you're just saying that like having sex with your husband is gonna wash away everything that you went through and you're gonna forget it and you're gonna have like this mind-blowing orgasm from the first time you guys are together. I had just like some problems with all of that, especially since I've read some books about sexual assault and what the person is feeling and how then they approach sex in the future. Like, felt not cool for the movie to portray it as being like this magical and amazing thing so soon. I'm sure that it can be and it would be, but they didn't give a fair image of what that experience is like. And then I think ultimately that got me thinking to my 16-year-old self, 16-year-old Gloria, who like would watch something like that or read this book and have this like idea of what sex could be like based on what this movie portrays. And it is it's so unrealistic. It's like this fantasy world. It made me think about some things and I was just like mad at like the movie industry as large, because I was like, do all these directors have they never had sex? Because this does not seem legit, and you're portraying this like magical world when that is often not the reality for many. It can be, but I'm like, it's often not, and you're showing this as a norm. So I just had some overall problems with that. I'm not going to tell you to go or not go watch that movie, but I hope I gave a fair idea of what you might be getting into if you do go watch it, which is ultimately a secular romantic movie. There is some faith-based things in there, but ultimately you're getting this like very powerful love story between two characters. I feel like it is unfair for me to hold up this movie and say this is a Christian movie, so it should be like this. I'm just gonna hold it up to a bunch of other movies that I watch, and I will just say this movie, if I put it in the same category as like other romance movies, then it's actually pretty clean compared to others, and it doesn't have like crude humor that I'm not a fan of a lot. So would I rewatch it down the line? Probably. Yeah, there's just some stuff when watching this movie. I had some realizations from my own personal understanding around sex, honestly. Those are my thoughts. I'll leave it at that. If you have any other questions for me, or if you want to like dive into anything further, leave a comment down below. Happy to chat with you down there. And I hopefully, you know, somewhat tried to be concise with my thoughts on all this. I'm still thinking about it. I'm a constantly evolving person. My mind's always changing. I feel like I'm always learning about something new. Neither the book or movie are bad, in my opinion. Hopefully that all made sense. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring at all about my opinion on both the book and movie. I hope this made you think about some things, maybe. Happy February, happy month of love, and I will see you guys in another video soon. Bye.